I want to talk about the impact of the coronavirus crisis on the future of America's China policy and what it's doing right now in DC to our conversations on China and to our policy and to our politics here in the U.S. Right now, the U.S.-China relationship is at a real low. It's the lowest point it's been in possibly decades. And certainly, I would say 3 weeks ago, that was the case. The week that China kicked out 13 American journalists from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Time magazine, I believe. No, the Washington Post. It was the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. That's basically, it's like one step down from kicking out American diplomats. And that was, the result of a kind of a downward spiral. And as Simon mentioned, tensions have been building in the relationship for the past 3 years since Trump's election. And that's especially over the past year as, for example, Secretary Pompeo has gotten a lot more vocal and a lot more confident in his criticisms of China. Trump has, continued to, I think, surprise Chinese leaders in his willingness to really take China head on. The FBI's crackdown on Chinese scientists, not just Chinese scientists, but scientists in the US with ties to Chinese institutions and to the Thousand Talents program. There's been several things, especially in the past year, that have built up. And then in the past 2 months, it's really taken a nosedive. As I said, there's the tit for tat media war, journalist expulsions. We kicked out around 60 media workers who worked for for various Chinese state-run news outlets here in the U.S. And then with the coronavirus, there is intense anger in the U.S. And it's not just in D.C. It's not just politicians. It's across the country. If you look at polling, Americans in general are very angry at China and have the lowest opinion of China in a long time. And that's pretty much across the board. And there's a lot of anger about the way that China has approached its messaging, especially since the beginning of February. Anger about the disinformation that they have put forward, lying about the cover-up, denying the cover-up, putting out claims repeatedly that it was the US military that created the coronavirus and planted it in Wuhan, and that kind of disinformation. So there's intense anger in DC because of that. So that's been the cause there of where we are right now in the relationship. I want to talk about something that's really new, and I have a question mark here. The end of the bipartisan consensus. Maybe we might be looking at the end of what has really been a bedrock of in the U.S. China, the U.S. policy community and in politicians in the U.S., which has been what we call the bipartisan consensus on China, but that appears to be cracking. So for more than 2 years, Republicans and Democrats have, for the most part, agreed that the U.S. needs a China policy that acknowledges Beijing's hard authoritarian turn and the serious challenge that China's growing power presents to U.S. interests. I want to be clear that this consensus represents an attitude, it's a belief that China is a challenge. It's not a comprehensive set of actual policies that everyone agrees should be taken. People have different ideas about what should be done. I would say even more than that, though, there hasn't been a good sense, especially among Democrats or on the left, of what should be done, simply an acknowledgement that there is a problem. So I think in some ways you could say it's a more accurate description of the phenomenon that we're all talking about here is the death of the engagement narrative. The idea that if we engage with China, if we welcome them into institutions, it will somehow magically become like us. And very few people now really hold to that or are willing to at least say that publicly. That seems to have left quite a number of Democrats without much to say at all when it comes to China, particularly on the Hill, I would say. If you look at initiatives and resolutions and draft bills and bills that are actually passed, but I mean, even just draft bills coming out of our representatives on the Hill. Democrats are willing to sign on to a lot of things, but they don't typically lead them. They're not really vocal. Democratic China policy in the past 2 to 3 years has mainly just seemed sort of like Republican light. You know, we'll do what they do, but just like maybe not so meanly. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the consensus. It looks like it might be starting to unravel. Let me do the TikTok for you of that. So we obviously, as many countries, are under intense pressure right now due to the coronavirus, and that pressure is really, I think that it's obviously the factor here that's doing this. So the opening shot really for this was when Trump referred to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus and the Wuhan virus. This was the immediate dividing line between where you're going to stand. Are you going to say, yes, I'm willing to use that phrase, or are you going to speak out against it? And very quickly we saw Democrats and Republicans pull to either side on this. And what we've seen from there is, one, a huge rise across the country in racism and racist attacks and remarks against Asian Americans, and Democrats really rallying to that and saying we need to protect these people, and deciding that the way they need to protect them is by not talking about China. That's been that decision. And Republicans have said China's trying to erase the truth. They did something bad. We need to make sure that that record is not erased. We need to point to them and make sure that they cannot rewrite history as it's happening and say that this did not start in Wuhan. So Republicans believe China is to blame for the global pandemic, and that Beijing's propaganda campaign aims to erase the truth. But Democrats say that emphasizing the coronavirus's links to China inflames racism against Asian Americans, and that it's a cover for the Trump administration's own mishandling of the epidemic. And I'd say in the past 2 weeks, we've really seen that taking off, with Republicans really doubling down on saying this is China's fault. We need to launch an investigation. We need to make it possible for Americans to sue China for damages. Let's talk about reparations. Trump just yesterday announced that the U.S. is going to freeze funding for the World Health Organization, in part because of how it has seemed to echo China's, Beijing's own rhetoric, the Chinese Communist Party's own rhetoric regarding the coronavirus. So you've seen such a doubling down, and I believe that is it's in part, because China did cover it up, but it's also in part because they know that the Trump administration did not do a good job, especially in the first 2 months or the crucial 6 weeks from when we got our own first coronavirus cases up until they started, the curve of the number of cases started really rising exponentially. We're in the middle of a horrible crisis. The United States has the highest number of deaths of any country. We have the highest number of cases of any country. The emperor has no clothes. Our administration messed up. And it is, I think, easier for Republicans to point fingers at China than to acknowledge that. And Democrats don't want to let that happen. So the bottom line right now in DC is that pushing back against China in any way has become politically toxic for Democrats. They're seen as supporting racism and enabling the Trump administration. And I want to give an example of this. It's, I think, a perfect sort of tempest in a teacup to explain how exactly this is breaking apart the bipartisan consensus. There was a bipartisan resolution in the House that was introduced in late March. I read it. It was very factual. It was a TikTok of the early cover up. This happened on this date. This happened on this date. China did this on this date. This doctor was arrested on this date. And then it said, but we know and everyone knows that the virus originated in Wuhan, and we don't believe Chinese disinformation. And then it condemned the detention camps in Xinjiang, and it also condemned the expulsion of American journalists. This is not controversial. It's not. It's very factual. Jim Banks, who is a pretty fiery Republican representative from Indiana, demanded that leaders in Beijing publicly state that there's no evidence that COVID-19 originated anywhere else but China. The resolution very notably avoided controversial phrases. It did not say Chinese virus or Wuhan virus. And Seth Moulton, who is a Democratic representative from Massachusetts, he was the only Democratic signatory on the resolution. He ended up retracting his support for the resolution after he came under heavy criticism from primary challengers and from Representative Judy Chu, a Democrat from California, and others. So I have the screenshot here of this tweet. This is from Roger Lau, who was the campaign manager for Elizabeth Warren for her presidential campaign. So a pretty prominent guy in the Democratic Party. And he said, responding to the introduction of this resolution, "This is just so wrong. It's lazy scapegoating, hateful fear-mongering, and just flat out dangerous. And Asian Americans have been victims of hate crimes that have been incited by ignorance like this. This is a global crisis and we're all in this together." This seems to be a fairly, something of an overreaction to a very fact-based resolution. And you get a sense of the pressure that Democrats are under. I think to some extent from their base and from others, to distance themselves from anything the Trump administration is doing and anything that Republicans are doing related to China. So here's just a couple more quotes. This one on the left is from Judy Chu. This is her criticism of the resolution. "During a pandemic like this, people are afraid and angry, and directing that anger towards China puts Asian American and Pacific Islanders at risk, as we have already seen with the insults and assaults against them." And Seth Moulton, when he withdrew his support for the resolution, said, "The resolution has caused division, the substance overshadowed by President Trump's divisive, xenophobic attempts to deflect from his administration's abysmal response to this virus. I apologize for that, and I am withdrawing my support for the resolution." So to be clear, it is now politically unviable at this moment for Democrats to express support for condemning the concentration camps in Xinjiang, the expulsion of journalists from China. It's just too toxic. All of this is breathing new life back into the engagement narrative that we all thought was dead. Calls for cooperation, which are truly legitimate at this time, right? There must absolutely be public health cooperation, global cooperation right now. But I think the idea is that there's a strong sense among the pro-engagement crowd that they were right all along. You know, they can say, see, this is what happens when we don't cooperate. This pandemic wouldn't be so bad, the US-China relations wouldn't be so bad. This is what happens when you pursue hostilities. I will say, though, that the reason I have a question mark about whether or not the bipartisan consensus is really cracking is that this could get better when the coronavirus crisis passes. It's hard to say at this point. I don't know, but but a reason I think that we really are headed down a forking path here is because of the presidential election that is coming up. So I want to talk about that, China and the 2020 election. Hashtag Beijing Biden. The Trump campaign is planning to make Joe Biden's posture towards China one of its major lines of attack during the 2020 campaign. The politics surrounding the US relationship with China may become a bigger domestic issue in this campaign than in any presidential contest in the last half century. And Trump officials they'd already been planning to brand Biden as soft on China, but the coronavirus pandemic has stoked public anger towards Beijing and made the attack more resonant in polling. So this hashtag Beijing Biden is a reference to a campaign that is starting. There's a pro-Trump super PAC that this week is launching a website I think it's called BeijingBiden.com. Oh dear. They're also doing a bunch of ads that showcase Biden, that show Biden as being soft on China, as being an enabler, as opposing the life-saving measures that Trump has taken, such as the early travel ban on China. I think that was the end of January. So here's just a quick screenshot of one of these ads, and this is from a speech that Biden gave at Sichuan University. I believe it was in 2011. And here's, so they have, on this ad, they have the recording of his speech, and he says, "It's in our self-interest that China continue to prosper." And when that's sandwiched with, accusations against his son, Hunter Biden, and, potential financial benefits that Hunter Biden gets from China, and from other statements from Biden, the idea is that, Biden won't stand up to China. He's not willing to make Beijing suffer, and that's bad for America.